industrial basing tutorial, and as you can see here we've got a custom base that we've made from scratch. And what we're going to try and do on this base is add a number of different painting techniques and processes in order to try and take this base from entry level right to something that is a lot more detailed and in general a lot more interesting to look. We've got a couple of flat surfaces as well as some sunken details that we can try and employ a couple of different techniques in order to try and lift this base from entry level to a much higher process of painting. I've taped off the edges of this just purely for an admin purpose of trying to sort of keep things a little bit neater and tidier, and we'll go ahead from here. So the first thing what I'm going to do is add an element of texture, and it's because part of this base is forming a rust technique. What we're going to use for this is some of the AK interactive corrosion texture. It's quite a fine texture. It's quite useful in terms of adding to a base to add paint layers on top of to increase the detail. What you can see here is that it's kind of like the usual texture paints that you might have come across. It's got quite a fine detail, almost like a fine grain of sand mixed with brown paint. And what we're going to do is just use this quite sparingly in terms of trying to add the basis for some of our rust texture. So I'm just adding it quite roughly in a few places here in terms of trying to build up that base for the rust. What you've got to imagine is that we're trying to create a rust base here that has been sat for a little while. It's developed a little bit of rust from wear and tear within wherever it is, whether that's in, kind of a ship kind of environment, whether that's in an industrial environment. But we're trying to create a dry rust. I know some of you may have followed our Instagram journey, and there's an element of wet rust within some of the stuff we've done previously, but we're trying to create a dry rust approach here. So you can see I'm adding it to some of the raised areas, some of the areas in terms of around the bolts, around some of the entry port levels, as well as some of the lower areas around kind of how dust and debris and rust might accumulate over time without much outside interference. Here we can see I've jumped to adding a prime layer. I did this off camera because priming within an airbrush environment and inside can be quite messy, it can be quite dusty, and can be just a bit more hassle than it's worth really. So here I've used Halford's Red Primer. It adds a really good base layer, it's quite powdery, it's quite a smooth finish, and just gives us a really good base layer to work off in terms of building up our paint layers from this point onwards. You can see here in terms of, you can see a little bit of the rust layers working up from this point. You can see how the red is going to add to some of that chipping and rust effect over time. As we're going to add layers, we're also going to chip some of those layers back in order to try and get some of the rust effect to be a little bit more sort of convincing over time. Most of what I'm doing here is using an airbrush. The airbrush I'm using here is an Harder & Steenbeck Evolution Pro 2. It's, in my opinion, an incredible workhorse of an airbrush. It is quite expensive, so you don't have to use that. The first colour we're going to use is, as you might be able to make out through this, is a P3 Bloodstone Brown. This is kind of a reddish brown, as you can see from the pot here, to build on the red we have from the primer. This should help us lift some of the levels, not only of the rust, but also to build some of our yellow layers. So I'm just going to apply this over the base in a rough kind of approach. We don't want to cover in terms of the whole flat surface. We aren't trying to make a kind of complete coverage approach here. What we're trying to do is apply an almost spotty approach and then pick out some of the areas where we would like to highlight rust later on. In terms of the flat surface, what we're trying to do is highlight some of the areas that we are going to want to apply some of the chipping to, which is the next technique we'll explore. But we just want to create that base for creating good layering over time. So give this a little bit of time to dry. Although not in real time, this is applying an element of realism in terms of, you know, kind of how we apply the paint layers over a sped up period. So what we're going to do now the paint's dried is apply our chipping layer. You can see here that the paint is dried in different layers and is dried slightly differently over the base in terms of how we've applied the layers itself. So what we're going to use here is a AK Interactive heavy chipping fluid. There are a few different chipping methods that you can employ. This is one I really enjoy over the kind of the basing and scenery kind of aspects. But you can use salt chipping, you can use hairspray, you can use some of the lighter chipping fluids like Vallejo, for example, which are good. But for this particular tutorial, I've picked AK Interactive. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply a couple of thin coats over time with the airbrush. You can of course apply this with a hairy brush. You can apply it a little bit more directly, a little bit more specifically, but because we're trying to chip the whole base over time on this tutorial, I'm going to apply it using the airbrush and doing a couple of coats. Once the coats have dried, you can see here there's an almost sheen to the areas that we've applied the chipping fluid. That's good for now because we can see the areas in which we've applied those that chipping fluid, sorry, in that chipping medium, and we can just sort of try to remember over time where those areas are and try to remember where the areas are that we want to achieve the greatest chipping. You know, towards the edges of those we'll get a slightly less chipping effect. The central areas will get quite an easy, larger chipping effect, which we'll explore over the rest of the tutorial. So now what I'm going to do is just apply the white layer, and this is because the yellow that I'm using within this tutorial is more of a clear coat over a couple of sub layers. So I know some tutorials and some painters will use a different yellow. What I like to do here is apply that kind of rusty red, reddy brown colour. Apply the white. It's a little bit washed out on the camera here, but apply the white layer and then look to add a clear yellow layer over the top. So from this first point, it's actually quite deceptive because on off camera the first layer is quite pastel yellow, whereas it looks quite deep yellow over the video sense here. So what we're going to do is apply a couple of thin layers over time, as if we were applying a Tamiya clear or a contrast clear over a pre-layer, and we want to really try and push that color contrast and that intensity of the color, because what we really want here is, you know, it's a hazard stripe. The hazard stripe, the nature of a hazard stripe wants to be quite intense, quite bright, and, you know, kind of really push the boundaries of that color contrast. So now that's dried, what we're going to do is we're going to apply some water. You can apply warm water, cold water, it doesn't really matter at this point, but what we want to do is just try and humidify that chipping fluid that we previously applied with the airbrush, and then look to try and chip away at some of that layer to get some of the brown from underneath. Now of course with this you can use, you know, earbuds, cotton wool buds. I'm gonna stick with brushes on this because I think the earbuds and cotton wool can add to an element of fibrous kind of leave behind on what you're trying to achieve. So I've got a couple of brushes here that are quite firm in terms of texture. A couple of them I've trimmed down from Games Workshop dry brushes in order to give that really kind of rough texture of what we're trying to get in terms of lifting that top layer of paint. This item is actually part of an airbrush cleaning kit and is a little bit kind of more substantial than using toothpicks and the like in terms of trying to just disturb that initial layer to create scratches from which we will develop our chipping over time. So I'm just going to apply some warm water over the base here, as you can see, and I'm applying it in areas where I kind of want to trigger that chipping response, and then I'm going to go over those watered areas with the fine kind of metallic tool in order to create initial scratches. And then what I'm going to do is tag in with the brush to try and just agitate some of those areas in order to create the initial chipping effect and start to build up from there. And as you can see here, I'm just kind of applying different levels of pressure in order to develop either large scratches or small scratches and just kind of build up over time. And this is entirely personal preference. You can leave it at this point. You can do what I do in terms of approaching the chipping process further. You can use a much larger firm brush like a toothbrush, as we'll use a little bit later on in terms of the top layer on this base, but it's all up to personal preference. So you could, you know, kind of create some small chips, some small scratches and leave it there, or you could do what we're doing here in terms of creating some small scratches and then using the brush just to agitate that layer a little bit further in order to create the larger chips and create that kind of greater worn effect over the base in general. So I'm just kind of moving around this in terms of trying to work out how I best want to represent damage over time, bearing in mind that there are going to be, you know, kind of the black hazard stripes over the top of this, so not all of these will actually be represented in the final base itself. Now we've got the core of our chipping here. What we want to do is just sort of create a base layer for how we chip through to the next level. So you can sort of see the sheen here in the base where I've off camera applied some more chipping fluid to the areas that are have been chipped already. And then what we're going to do is apply some tape in order to create the hazard striping, just to try and make our little journey into, you know, kind of weathering the hazard stripes through the process. And I'm going to use our scalpel, one of the sculpting tools, and some of our tweezers here in order to achieve a much closer, firmer knit of the tape on the hazard stripes, because the big thing we really want to avoid here is bleeding through of the paint under the tape, because that will create a much messier look in terms of the hazard stripes, and we really want a crisp, clean edge wherever possible. So what I'm going to do is just apply that first one where I kind of really want the first one to be, and really set that tone of the angle of the stripe. And I'm going to use one of our sculpting tools here that looks a little bit like a kind of dental tool, which I guess are quite similar, and just really get as neat and tidy as we can in terms of the edge of that tape. Like we said, what we really don't want is to not push this down enough and create a kind of a surface that allows for the paint to bleed under and just make it all look a little bit messy over time. We want it to look messy, but we want it to be controlled messy in a way that we want it to look, rather than just because we've looked like, you know, kind of looking like we've made a mistake with the airbrush or the tools we are using. From this point, what I want to do is measure out kind of roughly. You can be as precise or as rough as you want with this, but I measure, you know, kind of roughly of how far the next stripe will be with the next bit of tape, and then just go from, you know, kind of trying to work around the detail on the base itself, creating that smoothest surface as we possibly can in terms of preparing for the next paint layer. And I think one of the things here is to not be afraid of using the scalpel, using some of the sculpting tools to get around some of the items on the base itself in order to create that smooth surface and make sure that we can incorporate the detail but not have to worry too much about whether it affects the final sort of neatness of the product that we're trying to achieve. And as you can see, I've gone for a kind of quite a wide hazard stripe on this, assuming that it's, you know, a quite large industrial base. This is an 80mm base, so it's kind of fit for a Leviathan Dreadnought, so we don't need to be too, you know, kind of precise and neat and tidy with this. We want to try and make it, you know, kind of quite robust and stand out quite a bit. So now I've applied the tape, what I'm going to look to do is apply that next layer of paint, which is, in this example, a Tamiya flat black. So we're going to apply that with the airbrush, and we're going to apply a couple of thin layers, and you can notice from the tutorial actually here that the paint actually is thinned to a point where it dries in such a way that by the time we're coming to sort of the end of the base, we can go right back to and start to kind of go over and give a second layer to the base itself. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to add some subtle highlighting. Obviously it's a flat surface, we're trying to create that impression of light from a certain angle. I'm not going to be too specific here because we're trying to show the technique, but what I'm going to do here is take the next highlighted colour and just apply to some of the edges and then some of the edges of the stripes themselves, in order to just create and push that contrast of colour so it's not a flat black colour, despite some of the content that we're adding on top in terms of, you know, kind of the rust and the weathering. So now what we want to do is take our tweezers and remove the tape. A little bit of peel porn, as some people might refer to it, and I'm just trying to you know, kind of be fairly careful not to disturb the paint layers too much. Even though we are trying to chip through this, we don't want to create unnecessary chipping through being a little bit, you know, kind of haphazard with the paint, with the tape itself, and kind of forcing our hand in terms of where we want to apply those chipping. So you can see there's a little bit of fuzziness around the edges of the stripes here, but actually in this particular example that doesn't matter too much, because those bits of fuzziness are actually in relation to the chipping fluid that we're planning to, you know, kind of wear away on those edges anyway. So as previously, we're going to add an element of warm water. We're going to just kind of humidify and disturb those edges where the chipping fluid has sat from on top of the yellow, move it around a little bit, and then we're going to apply the same tools we applied before. So the airbrush cleaning tool, you know, kind of the toothpick, whatever you choose to use to disturb this initial layer of paint. And then we're going to use the firm brushes on top of that in order to just push some of those layers away and create those chipping effects and start to really add to that depth, that layer of weathering over time on this part of the base. So as you can see, I'm being fairly random. It's all part of user preference, and you can see on some of these aspects it's not just going straight to the brown underneath, it's applying an element of depth in terms of layering. So we've got some yellow appearing underneath, some of the brown, some of the red from the primer starting to appear, and it really just helps to over time build that impression of a kind of worn base that's been trodden over on numerous occasions by various different aspects of the environment we're trying to build. And then I'm just going to use a piece of kitchen roll or blue roll, whatever it is, just to take off that edge of dampness from the water we've added, just to remove some of that before we start to move on to the next stages. And then what I've done here is I've added an element of tape protection to that first layer, and I started to build up the paint layers on the top level here. So we're working first with kind of a blue-grey colour, similar to what we might use if we were, you know, kind of painting Space Wolves or something similar, and just try to build it out as a kind of a coloured walkway or whatever it is that you're trying to think of in terms of building up the story behind whatever piece it is you're painting. Then we're going to add the initial or middle highlight in terms of a slightly paler grey, just to start to bring that level up a little bit. And of course you remember back to the chipping stage that we applied, and a lot of this will be chipped away in terms of kind of traffic over a kind of a space of walkway or whatever, as you might envisage it. And then we're going to hit it with a final stage of a much lighter grey, but this is a thicker paint in a kind of designed to create a kind of speckled effect. And as you can see here, if you can, I don't know, just about make out, but there is a slight sort of light grey speckling effect starting to appear on that, and it's just to create again that extra sort of texture of wear and tear on this particular surface on the base. So then what we're going to look to do next is start to do what we did with the bottom layer on this, is apply some warm water and some of our weathering techniques in order to chip away a little bit of this paint and start to move forward in terms of how we try to add a little bit of interest to this base overall. So then we're taking a much firmer, shorter brush that I've applied, and what we want to do is also, I'm going to use here in particular a toothbrush because it's quite firm but also soft enough, and I'm going to use that in conjunction with the kind of the perceived movement of direction of how a model might interact with this base, because it's, you know, kind of a walking surface. So we've used that pin, we've used that that kind of fine element, and then we're going to use the toothbrush just to create a little bit of directional movement or directional wear on this surface. And really, again, like the rest of it, you can use it in as much or as little of a capacity as you want. So then beyond that, we're going to tape this off and we're going to look at the metallic aspects of the base. I've taped off the lower and upper levels, and we're going to look to target the girder, the upper level kind of trimmings, the fencing aspect which has been broken, as well as the little kind of ports that we have on that lower level. And what I'm looking to achieve is actually a metallic effect that doesn't use any metallic paint until the dry brush phase, which you'll kind of see from this point. So we're going to use a Tamiya flat black or rubber black, depending on what you have available, but we're going to apply that from that kind of every direction just to make sure we kind of have it covered off, and it almost looks like we're going back to the prime phase of this particular base, but all will become a little bit clearer after a little bit of time. So just cover all the bits that you want to do metallic with this kind of flat black or rubber black, kind of off black colour, and then we can build up the metallic and the rust textures from that point once we're complete and once we're happy, with a little bit of the rusty brown kind of showing underneath. So once we're happy with that rubber black in this case, or that flat black approach, we want a little bit of the rust brown to kind of show through that black underneath, and then from that point we will build on some of our rust textures and our rust colours. So from this point what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of the kind of reddish brown back into the mix. I know it almost seems counterintuitive, sorry, to go back to the brown after we've gone back to that kind of blackish grey colour. But what we want to do is start to pick out some of the more specific areas in which we want to apply some of the rust textures, some of the rust colours, and that kind of worn metallic appearance that we want from this particular base. So be quite sporadic. As you can see here, we aren't looking for complete coverage. We're looking to just sort of chip away little areas and go, you know, kind of from the areas where we might think that that rust or wear on this kind of activity might build up over time. And again, you can be as precise or as generic as you feel, but in these places what I'm trying to do is really the camera doesn't really kind of portray what we're achieving here, but those initial areas of brown do start to fade off a little bit, and actually we want to pick those out with a little bit more of a vivid kind of nature in order to build on those with the textures that we're going to apply slightly later. So now we've added those blacks, those off blacks, those greys, and some of the brownish rust textures. We're going to look to add a dry brush of some of our metallic, just to pick those areas out, similar to how you may have seen in creating tank tracks and some of the other kind of rusted metal techniques you may have seen out in the community. But the real star here is creating that metallic approach without just painting the base in a metallic colour, washing it, and then building up from there. So what we're doing is just kind of going over certain areas with a dry brush, quite a firm dry brush, and kind of trimming off quite a lot of that paint just to pick out the edges, just to pick out some of the worn surfaces that, you know, a hand might catch and, you know, kind of bring to a shine over time, or some of the content that might just sort of pick out from within a rusted surface. You know, you may have seen over time there's a rusted surface that is mostly kind of a crusty brown reddy colour, but has that, you know, kind of aspect of a metallic tinge on the corner or whatever it is from where it's been exposed to external influence. And I'm going over a few different areas here because we're trying to build again that level of sheen on some of the surfaces, in terms of, you know, some of them might just be a slight texture of metallic from the edges. Some of them might be a little bit more dependent on, you know, kind of if we perceive those areas of the environment as some that have been, you know, kind of in contact with external factors quite often. And as you can see, we're really starting to pick out that aspect of metallic nature without just, you know, kind of relying on that metallic base of these particular items. So this is something, you know, you can really decide on how you want it to look. I keep going over some areas because I'm, you know, wanting to make sure they fit what I feel they should fit for the base, but also some of this aspect is available to dull down over time because of some of the other textures we're going to apply in terms of oils or enamels or kind of rust and those sorts of things. So here we are in terms of the base metal effect. We're going to peel off the rest of that blocking out technique, and we're going to prepare ourselves for adding some of the initial stages of oil weathering here. So as you can see, the base is really starting to come together now, but what we're really missing is some of that aspect of a worn kind of industrial look over time. So what we're going to look to do now some of those previous methods have dried and have settled in a little bit, we're going to look to add some oil wash. Now, for any of you that haven't really used oil wash in the past, this is slightly different from some of the other forms of paint wash that you might have used, in the sense that the idea with oil wash is that you apply quite a thick coat, as you can see here. It's going on with no regard to how we might try to initially or seemingly preserve the nature of the rest of the paint job, but a little bit more will become clear in terms of an oil wash dries much slower. It is far easier to manipulate than something like a water-based wash, so we can apply it much more liberally and then manipulate it after time without worrying too much about how quickly it's going to dry. So over this base, you can see I've been fairly liberal in terms of how I've applied the oil wash here, applying it a little bit thicker in some areas to try and create that depth on that upper level, trying to create some of the, again, the worn depth of brown textures and warmth to the surfaces that we have here, but also not being too cavalier in terms of how we apply it to the base, trying to remain kind of cognizant of where some of that worn warmth and that kind of brown rusty dusty texture might appear over time on a surface such as this in reality. So here you can see that some of the paint has started to pool a little bit closer towards the front of the base, and in a lot of cases with oil washers you can wipe them off. I'm trying to be a little bit more precise here in terms of creating a much more dirty, kind of worn look. So I'm using a cloth here or a rag, and I'm dabbing away at some of that oil in terms of trying to remove the most of it, whilst also leaving enough behind to create that dirty, kind of worn, rusty, dusty, dirty appearance of a surface that's seen quite a bit of wear and tear. And of course you can manipulate the base quite well here in order to, make some of the oil wash pool on certain surfaces in order for you to dab it away. You can manipulate the oil wash in terms of, if you feel like you've dabbed too much away, you can apply a little bit more and then dab it away in certain kind of certain methods and techniques in terms of how you want this to look. It is important to realize that until this oil wash is completely dry, which you will probably need to leave for a number of days if you don't use an external influence, this will be kind of available to manipulate over time for a fairly wide period, so you can change how you want it to look a little bit, and just kind of in the immediate term. So as you can see here, the oil paint has dried quite well. It's dried a lot more matte than it might have looked originally, and here is a selection of some of the additional weathering paints that we're going to use. You can use streaking grime and the various colours of rust streaks, but we're going to focus majority here on rust streaks. You could use the lighter rust streaks to start with and in its entirety, but we're going to build up from that darker colour of rust streak to the lighter colour of rust streak, again just to add some of that aspect of depth of texture and colour. So similar to the oil, what you're going to do is dab elements of the enamel rust streaking paint on the areas that you want to, and then apply an element of white spirit to distribute that pigment around a little bit, just to try and kind of wash out so it's not as intense in a single area as you might want. This enables you to spread the pigment around a little bit and control on a lot more of a level of how you really want this base to look over time. Similar to the oil paints, these enamel paints and enamel textures from AK and various other suppliers take a significant amount longer to dry over time, and even when they look dry, you're still able to manipulate them with something like white spirit or Sansadora, which is kind of a little bit more of an expensive medium, but is a little bit more fragrance free and is a little bit less offensive. But what you can do with this is you can apply it in certain spaces, as you can see here from the tutorial, and then you can manipulate it around the base or the model or whatever it is that you're deciding to paint with this, and create a lot more of an intentional texture, an intentional surface colouring, rather than being kind of necessarily stuck to how the paint lands on the surface as you apply it. So you can be a little bit rougher. As you can see, I'm manipulating it around to trying to create rust streaks and a little bit of dripping and kind of movement around the surface in general. What we're going to do then is next move on to the lightest rust texture, just to pick out some of those areas as you would like to highlight a model usually. But again, with the enamel based texture, you can kind of apply this and manipulate it around a little bit more for a little bit longer before things get kind of too permanent. You can speed up this process with any of the oils or enamels with a hairdryer if you want to. Kind of if you're happy with how things look, you can speed that process up quite quickly. Or you can leave it a little bit longer to dry naturally, and you can think, if I don't like that, I can use a little bit of white spirit or whatever you might like to use to try and kind of fix or change how the pigment is appearing on the surface. So what I'm trying to do here is just pick out some of the lighter areas with that rust texture, and then go back over time just to distribute them around a little bit with a little bit of white spirit, in order to create again that more natural appearance of how rust might start to appear on a surface over time. This actually is a little bit easier on something like a tank or a marine or a piece of scenery, in terms of, you know, you can start to appreciate using real life experience how rust might appear on a surface, but you have a little bit more freedom in terms of flat surfaces like this, in terms of how you think rust and weathering would appear over time on this surface of choice. So that's most of the textures and stuff applied and dried. So what we're going to do is just finish the base off by black rimming it. You can do this in a few different ways. I kind of use a fairly standard and old school way of this, which is the hairy brush. Just mix up a little bit of black paint. In this particular example, I'm using a flat black from Vallejo. So we just go around the whole of the base just to neaten up and tidy up that edge of the base, just to kind of present a much smoother and neater image of the model in its entirety. And then just don't be afraid to go over some of the areas. These are going to dry quite quickly again if you mix the paint correctly, so just don't be afraid of going back over areas that you might not be entirely happy with, using a little bit of water if necessary, just to sort of thin that paint out over the surface and create that smooth texture. And here we are. This is the finished base. The oils are dried, the textures are dried, and the base is, the rim is dried, and you know, here we are. This is the result of what you can achieve over this tutorial. So hopefully this has all been useful and you would like to employ it in the future. And to finish this tutorial, I'd just like to show that these are all of the ingredients used within this tutorial to create the base that we can see at the front here. Although the lighting may not be ideal, this is the sort of the rough finished effect you can expect to achieve if you follow this tutorial. I don't like showing this at the start of the video because I think this kind of volume of ingredients and equipment can be quite intimidating, but it's just to show through each stage that this is actually a fairly easy tutorial to follow, and actually with all these pieces of equipment that are available in a lot of different sources, it's entirely achievable. So thank you for visiting, and see you next time.